Okay, so good evening, and tonight we're going to be discussing the relationship between an employer and an employee, and what Judaism, what Yiddishkeit has to say about that, what Torah has to say about that, because Torah has what to say about everything. So I decided to bring my employer, and we'll see where this takes us.
Normally when we meet together we have coffee.
That's right.
But where's the coffee tonight?
I guess we want to go to sleep soon.
Because you want to sleep, okay.
That's right. So we're going to leave out the coffee for tonight and just talk about a work relationship and what does Torah have to say about that relationship. And let's get started. So, first of all, let's discuss what's the Torah view on the rights of an employer. So, when someone's employed, seemingly they're getting paid to do something, they have to do it. What rights does an employer have in Jewish law and in Jewish thought? Let's start with that.
Okay, so it's a very complicated question actually, because first of all, there's a lot in the Talmud, as Torah governs every part of our life. So certainly work relationships and employee-employee relationships is also governed by the Torah, of course. And there's actually a lot in the Talmud and the Gemara about employee and employee relationships and work contracts and so on and so forth. The Gemara and the Talmud discusses different structures of employment. So, for example, you have something called a schir yom, a person that works daily, works by the day. A person is employed for a certain amount of time, or a person who's a contractor. In other words, he's employed or she's employed to do a particular job, so to make a garment or to something like that. But let's talk more about someone who's employed to work by the hour or work during the day. Like I employ someone to work my field or to clean my house or whatever the case is, right? Someone who works for me or in a business situation. So I think it's important to give a little bit of introduction. First of all, like this, when it comes to monetary laws in the Torah, right? There's two ways it can operate. In other words, like this. Normally we say that halacha, Jewish law, doesn't change. In other words, you can't...
It's absolute.
It's absolute. We can't decide that we're going to keep Shabbos in a particular way and call it keeping Shabbos. We can't do that. So keeping Shabbos, keeping Shabbos.
Yeah.
Can't decide, well, we'll agree to put on tefillin a bit differently, then okay. But when it comes to contractual agreements or monetary laws, it's a little bit different. In other words, like this. There is a baseline halacha, and then there's what we call, if I'm Michoel, in other words, if we agree, consensual agreement, to operate in a particular way, then that's valid, right?
Yeah.
There are exceptions to that. For example, one exception is that in the Torah, one of the mitzvahs says you're not allowed to lend money on interest.
Even if they both agree.
Now, there is a way to structure that. If you structure the loan in a particular way, it's called a heter iska, and it could be. But in a regular loan, I can't give you $20 and say I'll lend you $20 for a month on condition you give me back $25, right? Even if we both agree that we don't mind.
That's right.
But for example, we could agree. For example, we could decide. I could sell you a house, and I could tell you that the laws governing me selling the house, we both agree that we're following the secular law of the place, for example, or the civil law of the country. Even though it might mean that one of us loses or gains money in relation to the way the Torah law should actually work, but because we both agree to do that, then that could be valid. So I say that because when it comes to employment relationships, there is a basic halacha law, which the Gemara talks about a lot, the Talmud talks about a lot. And then of course there's things that we make up, and that's very, very important. So let's start with the basic law, right? There are employer rights and employee rights, and they're radically different to modern law, which is very interesting. So, when you talk about the rights of an employer, it works like this. The Torah takes the concept of stealing very, very seriously. Right? So, for example, if I pay you by the time, I pay you for a certain amount of time, so you work for me during the day. Now, it was typical in ancient times, for example, that people would be employed to work the whole day. Because in general, people used to work from sunrise to sunset. That was the way they used to work, right?
There's no...
Right? Then, on baseline Torah law, there's very little breaks. very little.
There's no time to go for a surf.
Right, exactly. There's no smoke or breaks or beer breaks, whatever the case is. There are certain things that you have to do. So, for example, of course, you have to give time for the person to eat, right? But it's not like in modern law where, governments or the regulations are you have an hour lunch break and you do whatever you want, people go and, they go and do exercise.
Right.
In Torah law, there you take a break, you eat, and you come back, right? An employer is obligated to give an employee time to do essential mitzvahs. But just to give you an idea of how strict this is, what I'm going to obviously discuss now is very brief, but it goes much, deeper, much more complex. But to give you an idea, let's say, we know if you eat bread, we bench, right? Now, benching has a certain structure. So benching, the way we bench today, there's certain essential blessings, and then there's certain additions that came later, right? Yeah. In theory, intrinsically, an employer has a right to tell the employee you can only bench what's obligatory. You can't bench the additions.
Right.
Because when you bench the additions, you're taking away from
We're talking about a few seconds, a few minutes.
Yeah, a few minutes, yeah. But you're taking away from our time. You're losing productivity, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there's not torture, or not slavery, because we'll soon see you have to treat your employee very, very nicely. But it does mean that that your time, you're on company time. When you work for someone and you're getting paid by the time, your time is not yours. Okay? To translate into modern day time, for example, without permission from the employer, an employee may not make a private phone call in the middle of the day. Right?
So, we'll continue in a second, just to sort of push back on that for a second. So, if that's the case, then someone who makes a private phone call, if there's a mutual understanding between the two, that's just what happens in this workplace. And now that's normal, would that change? Okay, so like this. So the exception to it is like this. There is, number one, by contractual agreements. So let's say if we make a work contract, if when I employ you, we decide, I'm employing you, but I do agree that you could spend, 15 minutes a day for private phone calls, or if you need to make important phone calls, whatever the case is, I don't mind, and that's okay. Then that's fine, right? But it's something that's not a given. In other words, in Torah law, it's not a given, right? Now, there is another concept in Jewish law called minhag hamokem. The custom of the place. In other words, what's accepted practice. So accepted practice, again with certain provisions, accepted practice does have validity. So if a community, a shtetl, whatever it is, or there's like you have in sort of union, really, like modern day unions, but there's a similar concept in halacha where, all tailors get together, and this is like the conditions they have to be employed or something like that. And there is certain accepted practice, and then you have to abide by them. But I'm saying these are only things which are exceptions. They come later, but they're not really. They're exceptions. They're not the rule. There are sort of exceptions, and they're legitimate exceptions, and they're very, very practiced today, right? And that's fine, right? I'm saying that because the truth is like this: that in the modern world, so obviously it's very different, and people get breaks and things like that. But there's a lot of talk about people doing private stuff during time and how good that is or how bad that is. Sometimes people say, well, as long as I'm getting the job done. That's not so simple because if you spend more time, you might get more productivity. In modern society, there's different sort of approaches about sometimes you're more flexible, then you get more productivity, whatever the case is. But nevertheless, in terms of really, it should be. Sometimes people. Okay, so there's a certain minimal amount of accepted. People know that if you call your wife during the day for a second and say, or your husband, that's fine. But to do more than that, there's a lot of. I heard once research being done about how much screen time, how much people spend on out of work time on social media, for example, or checking the email, private email, things like that. That's actually wrong. And if a person is observant Jew keeping halacha, to go beyond what's the normal practice, to fit in the normal practice, that's fine. But to go beyond what's normal practice is really a problem. Similarly, by the way, I should mention, using resources of the place you work for your own private use, right? So a guy needs to write a note, for something, or this is the paper
his son in school or his daughter in school in year 6 is doing a project and said to their father, "Can you please print? I need this printed in color." And the work has a color machine, so very quickly he prints it. It's 3 pages, print it in color and take it home. Halachically, a baseline halacha, very, very problematic.
Unless you ask permission.
So I saw some of the poskim write that if a person's in that position and he's thinking or she's thinking to himself, is that permitted or prohibited? You need to think to yourself, what would you do if the employer was standing there? Right? In other words, if the guy's not around, so you can't ask permission. I mean, it'll take you half an hour to find him as permission. I mean, that's not exactly right? So one of the ways to figure that out is like, if he was standing here, would I do this? Or something I do only behind his back? If something I do behind his back, it's actually a problem. It's theft. And stealing is a very, very serious thing in halacha. But if you think it's something that you know that he wouldn't mind you doing, in fact, you would easily do it even if you were standing there. That's your relationship with him, whatever the case, or her, whatever the case is. Then that's okay. But again, that's just to understand the baseline concept.
The value here is that you need to really value the money of what belongs to the owner.
Right. In other words, he's paying you or she's paying you, and it has to be valued and respected. You get paid on company time. It's not your time.
There's an interesting discussion. I just remember now. I can't remember what the whole discussion about. People who learn in a kollel, like people who are paid to learn, or even the equivalent in the secular side, someone who's paid to study. There'll be a similar idea. Like if you're wasting time, you're the same thing. You're not using your time, which is supposed to be paid for. It's interesting. Quite a severe thing.
In other words, it really doesn't make a difference what the person's paying you to do. If they're paying you to do, whatever they're paying you to do, you have to respect and you have to use the time properly. It's not your. In other words, bottom line is not your time.
Right. Is there a difference? Like I know in Jewish law there's such a concept difference between being paid for a time or being paid for a job.
Yeah, so
for example, it comes to like laws of Shabbos and things like that.
Yeah, so we pay for a job is different. In other words, I pay you for a job, but then we make up. Then there's a contractual agreement or even agreement by word. By the way, in employee-employee relationships, agreements that are done verbally are sometimes not binding, but they're considered very serious to break. Right, so there's a way to make agreements more binding, like by documenting with witnesses and things like that. But then there's sometimes that we make up something, we have to keep to it. So if you ask me to do a job for you, whether it's to write an article or
paint your house,
or paint your house,
so you have a year to do it,
and we make up, it'll be done by a certain time. So first of all, the employee has a responsibility to make sure it's done on time. But the employer has then he can't say the time doesn't belong to the employer, then the time belongs to the employee.
Right.
As long as it's finished on time. In other words, as long as I do, then you can say as long as I get the job done.
Right.
So it does depend how you pay it. So as long as you get the job done, then that's okay. You want to do it at night, you do it at night, you want to do it in the morning, whatever you want to do it. As long as it gets done properly. In an accepted way. In other words, the quality is acceptable and done well and so on and so forth.
Okay, so that's the employer. So now let's go to the employee for a second. So the employee does have to respect the employer's time and et cetera, et cetera. What rights does the employee have? What can the employee demand from the employer? What kind of respect? What kind of treatment in Jewish law?
Okay, so first of all, like this. First of all, one thing that's very clear in the Torah, in fact, one of the 613 mitzvahs, is the absolute obligation to pay on time. Paying late is a very big problem in our life. Right? So there's a mitzvah in the Torah called Loisolin P'ula Sochri. So if someone does a job for you, so it depends on the pay structure, but let's take the typical case that the Torah is talking about. Someone gets paid by the day, someone works from sunrise to sunset, and then they come for their wages. If you wait till the next morning to pay them, that's a transgression of one of the 613 mitzvahs. If they're watchmen and they watch at night and they pay in the morning, if you wait till the next night, you've transgressed. Okay, so you have a few hours, all right? But so they see the value of paying on time. So in other words, the agreement is a very sacred agreement. In other words, yes. So the time belongs to the employer, but the agreement has to be honored. So therefore, it's just there you already see that there's okay. Then there's a certain amount of care. For example, we see different mitzvahs in the Torah. So for example, in the Torah there's a mitzvah. Let's say if someone is harvesting your I don't know, someone's cherry picking, right? So they're allowed to, let's say, take a little bit of the cherries, eat some of the cherries on the way, like while there are different laws about it, but while they're doing it, they're allowed to kind of eat, right? So they need to be taken care of in a respectful way. You can't say, well, no, you're picking cherries all day, but you can't even take one cherry.
Right.
That's not right. In other words, there's a certain acceptable amount of stuff that you could use for your own benefit. That's part of your regular care, right? But in general, Torah is very strict on how you respect another person. So, to use an extreme example, we know in the Torah it isn't even an employer-employee relationship, but more of a master-slave relationship. Now, in the Torah, we have a concept of slavery. Obviously, that's almost sounds politically incorrect, but that's the fact. However, it needs to be understood that when we talk about slavery in the Torah, it is not the same slavery that people think about when they think about the beginnings of America. You know what I'm saying? When there was real slavery, right? Slavery in the Torah, people don't come in chains and they don't get kept in and chained up at night. You know what I'm saying? That kind of thing, right? In fact, the Gemara says, there's different structures of slavery, the Jewish slave and a Canaanite slave, there's different sort of levels of slavery, but let's say a Jewish slave, there's a concept of a Jewish slave, one Jew works for another, but he's a slave. It's more, not so much slave, it's more like a lease. In other words, they lease themselves and they're available for the master all the time, right?
Usually it's also to repay something they stole.
Repay loans, they stole, whatever the case is, right? The Gemara says, the Talmud says, that Misha Kona ever Kona Odin Latzvay. Someone who acquires a slave is really like acquiring a master.
Yeah.
Because you have to treat the slave with absolute dignity and reasonably, right? So, for example, to give a couple of examples, a slave is working for you, which means you can ask slaves whatever you need. That's the thing, right? If you don't need anything at the moment, right, it's prohibited to ask the slave to do a job just because you want to keep them working.
Right.
Right? It's considered inhumane to do such a thing, right?
Yeah.
The slave has to receive proper care. So working conditions are important, right? To the point where the Gemara says that if a person lives in a house and they only have one pillow at night, the pillow goes to the slave, not to the master, right? The person has to sleep with a pillow, right? You only have one pillow, that's too bad, so give it to the slave. Right, you employed someone, you have to. So I don't know exactly all the details in terms of a work relationship, but I do know that a person has an obligation to treat people properly, and particularly if people work for you. I guess how much more so if it's just not a slave relationship, but it's actually just a more contractual relationship. A person has to be treated properly, which means a person needs to be given the tools, but you can't expect a person to do a job without giving the proper resources. So resources are important, working conditions are important, at an acceptable level, and I suppose it depends on the time and the place and so on and so forth, and dignity and all those kind of things. Now, I'll just give you an example. So the Gemara has an interesting little piece there where it talks about a contractual agreement where one of the things the employer was going to provide the employee is food.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say I don't think this is so common nowadays, but there's a concept where let's say you work for me for the day, and part of the agreement is I provide lunch, right? So the Gemara says it's really important that at the beginning of the contract we actually make up exactly what that means.
Yeah, what's on the menu?
Because otherwise, what's on the menu exactly? Otherwise, the employee will have the upper hand. Because the Gemara says why? Because the Gemara says that it's talking about Jewish relations. The Gemara says that we know that the Yidden, the Jewish people, are called B'nai Melachim, right? The sons of kings. So therefore, a person, if I didn't make up with you what is going to be for lunch, then afilu suda shloimeh b'shaita, even a banquet of King Solomon, right, in his time, won't be sufficient because you're a king, right? Yeah. So the logical thing to do is don't just rely on I'll give you lunch.
Stipulate exactly.
Right? We actually have to contractually agree. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Otherwise, the employee will have the upper hand in such a case. Say no, fish and chips is not good enough for me. I need the expensive meat. You know, saying that kind of thing. So that's yeah.
Okay. So I guess that's sort of more the laws, Jewish law in connection with. Before we get to the next part, maybe you just want to touch upon how do you. So these are all Torah laws, and obviously the civil laws. How do you sort of put them both together? So in other words, as someone who is governed by Torah law, we want to touch upon a little bit the concept of dinah de malchus adina.
Okay, so generally speaking, we have a rule of dinah de malchus adina, which means the law of the country becomes Torah law. Now, that's a very complicated part of Jewish law, because what does that mean? So generally, it means for example, there are lots of different opinions. So not really related to this topic, but just touch upon it, right? So there is a concept of dinah de malchus adina. The law of the country is a law of Torah. In other words, we are obligated by Torah to keep the law of the country, which is true. So anything that's legal, illegal, we're supposed to keep the law. We're supposed to pay taxes. We're supposed to put on seatbelts. we're supposed to not speed. It's really all part of the.
Yeah.
Okay, there's discussion halacha exactly what areas of civil law that includes. Does it include all the monetary stuff? It includes everything, and so on and so forth. Generally, especially as it says in halacha, when we live in what's called malchus shel chesed, right. Regimes which are benevolent, in other words, regimes which are kind to the Jews, and we have freedom of religion. We have to appreciate that. We should be law-abiding citizens, generally speaking, right? Yeah. However, there are exceptions to that, meaning, for example, if civil law, secular law, directly opposes Torah law, right? I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example. So let's say, for example, all right, when secular laws compromise freedom of religion, right? So let's say an example, right? I'll give you a wild example. Let's say an example. There was a law that you can't daven on airports. In airports, you can't pray. Yeah. Right? And you had a connecting flight and you were in transit, and you would miss putting on tefillin or davening shachris. It would be perfectly legitimate to break the law and to daven shachris. Anyway, yeah. Right? Pray anyway. Okay. Now, in work relationship matters, that becomes complicated because generally speaking, for example, and I'm not an expert in this field, so I'm just giving a general idea. Yeah. I'm not ruling any halachas. Yeah. No. So let's say that civil law says it's legitimate for an employee to make private phone calls, right, during the day, right? I'm not sure that means that becomes permissible. In other words, when Torah law...
civil law is more lenient than Torah law, it would have to be strict like Torah law.
Exactly. So normally the rule is that when civil law is more lenient than Torah law, then you have to keep Torah law. Right? In other words, it's only when civil law says, let's say Torah law doesn't mandate you wear a seatbelt, but civil law says you should, then you obviously have to wear a seatbelt, right? Let's say it was the other way around. If civil law says for whatever reason that you don't have to wear a seatbelt, but Torah law would say you do, then you do, right? I'll give you an example in that regard. There are certain practices, let's say like bungee jumping, for example, right? It's legal, correct? Yeah. I'm not convinced that it's permissible according to Torah law. Right. Because in Torah law we have a concept, you discussed this a few months ago. Yeah. They have to do something that has an element,
Danger.
That is dangerous beyond the reasonable danger, beyond the reasonable risk, right? So we're not talking about going in a car. Going in a car is also dangerous, right? So it's also risky, but there's reasonable risk we're allowed to take. That's what we're. But we know that you're not supposed to engage in practices. I don't know if bungee jumping, I don't know the latest statistics, but let's say bungee jumping is dangerous. Yeah. So there are certain practices that might be legal according to civil law, but Torah law says no, you got to be safe and you're not allowed to do it, right? Yeah. Or I'll give you another simple example. There are certain practices of plastic surgery, for example, right? Yeah. Plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery, in other words, is not always permitted according to Torah law. Now, it's always permitted according to civil law. Yeah. That doesn't mean you're allowed to do it, right? So the same thing, in employee-employee relationships, there might be times where civil law says it's okay to take a break or to do something, or to use something that belongs to the employer, but not necessarily according to Torah law. You'd have to look into that. Now, the difference in employee-employee relationship is that in many places, when I employ someone, even if we both observant Jews,
we'll say that we're going to go according to
the understanding is we're following common practice. Right. Okay, so then that's different. Right. If that's the common understanding, then it becomes permissible, as I said, because it's monetary stuff, it becomes permissible in Torah law also. So we certainly have to keep the laws of the land. If Torah law is more strict, then you really have to keep them, unless it's understood that in monetary stuff that we follow in common practice. Yeah. Because contractually there's sort of an agreement, that's how we do it.
And I think even if that's true, I think it's still relevant to know the Torah law, besides the fact that obviously we have to know Torah just for the sake of knowing Torah. It's also relevant because there's values there.
Right. So you have
to apply the value.
Exactly. The value is very, very important. I mean, the whole respect for the employee's time and the respect for the dignity of the employee, all that is very, very critical and very, very important.
Yeah. Okay. So that's all in terms of...
I want to mention, because that's just important to mention when we're talking about it, and the one exception about common practice would be if there was an employer and employee and both are committed to halacha, and if they have a dispute, even if their contractual agreement is to follow civil law, they really are obligated actually to resolve their dispute
according to Torah law
in a base din.
Yeah.
Now, the Beis Din might rule according to civil law because that was the contract,
Correct.
right? But actually it needs to be a Beis Din, Dayanim, observant Dayanim, who right? Now, there can be an agreement, there could be a Dayan together with a civil expert and so on and so forth, but actually just to go and resolve things in a secular court is problematic according to Allah.
Yeah. Okay. Which is obviously a whole
and a whole other section, but it's important to mention because that doesn't always, that's not included in what we said before, that common practice, you can just do, that kind of stuff.
Right. Okay, so that's all the sort of the legalistic part of this. Now I want to get into more the personal growth aspect of this, and I think this is probably something which you can apply in many areas of life. Just a couple of things, maybe your thoughts, what Torah has to say, or just in general your thoughts about the topic. So, if an employer sees that an employee is not doing the job properly, there's obviously many options that the employer can do. The employer could fire the employee, if that's legal. The employer could try work out a way to encourage the employee to do better. So I guess the question is, what would be in your, as an employer, and I know all your employees always do the best job, but think theoretical for a second.
My employees are fantastic.
That's right. What would happen
by
if
the way, it's not a typical employee-employee relationship, just by the way, I should mention, because I'm also an employee. We actually work for a company.
Right. Okay, so that changes things.
A little bit.
Correct.
So in other words, in our case, for example, particularly, by the way, I should mention this.
So when there's a board...
If I can interrupt you for a second. So first of all, I might be the director of Bina, for example, but I still work for an organization.
For a board, yeah.
And there's actually an additional thing. First of all, there's something, and I think it's important to mention. The issue, for example, of using things for our private use is actually more important here because, number one, I'm under the same obligation because I don't own the business.
It's not your money. Yeah.
It's not a private business.
Yeah.
Second of all, there's a concept which we call momen hektish. When people support an organization and it's tzedakah, it's actually more community money.
Right. Especially saying an organization like this.
Right. So especially when it's a religious organization, and therefore the care, for example, the care for the building or the care for the respect for property, respect for the resources.
Right.
It's actually quite strict.
It's even more strict.
It's even more strict, yeah.
But
I know what you mean. Okay,
that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. But nevertheless, you have levels of management.
Correct. And you're obviously higher up there in the levels of management. So the question is, how would you go about seeing an employee not doing their job properly? And that's a very general question, so maybe you can sort of...
Okay, so you're right. It's a very general, it's a personal growth question, really. But before we answer it from a personal growth point of view, let's just answer it from a legalistic point of view. Today, it's become very, very complicated to dismiss people.
Yeah.
Right.
What does Torah have to say about that?
So that's an interesting thing. So in Torah, when there's a first of all, it's actually from a Torah point of view, it's really important to get the contract right from the beginning because. If I just employ you without any contract, it's actually quite easy to dismiss someone. In fact, it's quite easy for an employee to leave an employer, and an employer to dismiss an employee because
there is no contract.
In halacha, there's not a lot of notice you have to give. It will also make a difference if, for example, like in halacha, there's no unless it's the common practice, but again, in Be'er halacha, there's no real redundancy pay and these kind of things.
Yeah.
If a person is not doing their job, it's grounds for dismissal. So if a teacher is not teaching properly, a person not working properly, from a technical point of view, you don't need a lot of notice. Even if I don't want to run the business anymore, I'm not in the mood of this employee anymore, I want to employ someone else, you're allowed to do that. As long as the other person won't suffer tremendous loss. So you always need to factor in. I'm just saying, these are the issues halachic. Yeah. Okay, so it's always good to kind of, contracts are important, and it needs to be contracts on time, how much time it is, like that. Okay. If they are doing their job, then it's not so simple. You dismiss them, and that's be good. Anyway, that's a very complicated set of laws. But on a humane level, so to speak, in all relationships, and employee-employee relationships are no different. People need to be empowered. People need to be incentivized. People need to be valued, right?
Yeah.
And valued means that people aren't robots and people aren't... So from a practical point of view, if you're an organization, any organization, so we know that working as a team is very, very powerful. Valuing people's input is very, very powerful, right? So respect has to be given to every single person. In other words, the dignity that's given to every single person has to be the same. So it doesn't matter what role the person has in the business, whether they're the janitor or they're the marketing manager or high up in the chain. So there is a hierarchy. People work with people. People need to take instructions, and there's certainly a hierarchy. But the hierarchy has to be respected. I mean, even you learn this in the Gourarie. The Gourarie says that a person has to respect their students, for example, right?
Yeah.
Even though a student has to respect the teacher, different type of respect, but another human being always has to be respected. But similarly, from a productivity point of view, if you want people to be productive, you want people to be enthusiastic, you want them to feel ownership. Ownership doesn't mean that they do what they want. I think people mix this up a lot of times, right? In other words, yes, leadership means that the buck stops somewhere. Leadership means that someone has to take responsibility for making decisions.
Call the shots, yeah.
Someone has to call the shots, and sometimes you make what they call today captain's call. In other words, okay, you heard what everyone else says, but you decide it's got to be different, and you take responsibility for that. You reap the consequences.
Yeah.
Right? But at the same time, and also, I mean, you set the tone, you set the culture, but you have to value people's input. Otherwise, why do you employ them? The value of every relationship, as we've talked about many, many times, is not the sameness; it's the difference. When you bring people in, I think that's a problem with our relationship, is that we're too much the same. But right? No, but I mean, but nevertheless, we're still different. And part of building a team in any organization or any work-related matter, I suppose. I mean, I'm not an expert on business relationships, but I imagine they're the same. Is that you respect difference? That people's differences are valuable,
right.
And that everyone brings something else to the table. And the key is listening. The key is communication. The key to every relationship is communication. In other words, people need to feel valued. People need to feel listened to. Listened to doesn't mean that everyone has to agree with them, but they have to feel that they were given a really fair go. They have to feel that they really were listened to, and that their opinion counts, and that they are consulted, and that you don't just find out surprises, and people need to know what's going on. In other words, it boils down to the concept of respect. People need to feel respected. When people feel respected, they feel valued, and they feel they contribute.
Yeah.
Right. On the other hand, it's got to be a two-way street. In other words, people. It's a mutual respect thing. People need to feel that if they're valued, they also need to put in. Put in means you put in beyond what you're required to. So you don't say, "Oops, it's 5:00. I got to go," and that's it. Goodbye.
Yeah.
But no, you feel you put in more. So there's a bit of an unspoken sort of dedication that goes with it. But dedication comes with respect and being valued. So therefore, to go back to your question, if someone isn't doing the right job, number one, you need to find out why. You need to talk to them. People need to be spoken to with respect. People do need to. There is accountability. People need to be held accountable, but it has to be done in a respectful way. It needs to be done with, and also like everything. Often people don't operate properly in organizations because the expectations are not clear. Right? People need when you place someone, you need to know what is their role. Right? When people don't know what their role is, that's the beginning of the destruction. Right?
Yeah.
What am I responsible for? What do you actually want from me? What short term and long term? So if someone's given a project, when do you want it by? Is it reasonable? Can I do it? Let's talk about it. And actually, what do you want me to do? Right? Also, what do you want me to? Sometimes people are given tasks where they're told to plan something or strategize or something, and then someone comes over the head and goes and does something else and undermines them. People that's not going to work. So often when people aren't productive, there are sometimes people aren't productive because they lack the skills. People make employment mistakes. You employ someone and it's just. But by the way, it's very unfair, and I've seen this happen in organizations where people work for you and people don't like confrontations. They don't tell them that they're not doing the job properly, right. And then 6 months down the track, it blows up and there's a whole fight.
Yeah.
Like, oh, sorry. People, if you have a responsibility, if you employ someone, they're not doing a job properly, you need to tell them.
Yeah.
Respectfully, you need to sit down with them, have a nice discussion. Maybe we're misunderstanding each other. What is it? What's preventing you? So it has to be a respectful thing. If eventually it's clear that the person is not able to meet the expectation of the employer, then they have to part company in a respectful way. But very often, it's not the point. Very often the point is that you value people, you bring out the best in them. You give them a chance, you build them up, you give them the skills, give them the resources, and they produce.
Okay. And the other way around, I mean, I guess it's a similar question. What would, if an employee feels, I guess, disrespected or whatever the case is, how would you suggest an employee should stand up for themselves?
Well, same thing. I mean, I think there needs to be communication. Of people. I mean, there's a concept of judging favorably. Maybe the employee's making a mistake. Maybe they didn't realize. Right. Maybe it was inadvertent. Maybe they did something undermining the employee without knowing. So I think it boils down to communication, right? People shouldn't be afraid of difficult conversations. But that goes back, by the way, also to culture. People need to feel safe that they could do that, right?
Yeah.
That they could kind of complain in a respectful way, not to whinge all the time, but to yeah. So it's a matter of creating a nice, what they call in Hebrew, an avir, a nice atmosphere.
Yeah.
What they call today in English, culture. Right? Culture is a really, really important thing in everything. It's important in families, important in businesses. Right? Culture means what we call in Kabbalistic terminology the makif. In other words, it's the way things are done.
Yeah.
Right? You can go into any organization, you can tell, is it tense here, is it cold, or is it a warm place? Is it a place where people have fun? Is it a place where people respect each other, people joke around with each other? There's kind of mutual respect, is there, So people need to be safe. So just like an employer has to feel safe to tell an employee that, you're not meeting my expectations and talk it through, the same thing goes the other way around. You have to feel safe in talking about, there's a problem, I don't feel respected, I feel undermined, and then so on and so forth.
Okay. Sounds great. Anything else you want to add to the discussion?
So I might have got myself into real trouble tonight, because who knows? maybe tomorrow you're going to come, by the way, you said I should feel safe to...
That's right.
To complaints, I don't know.
Exactly.
But I think it's a good discussion, because I think people always need to check themselves and see. I think it's a good thing to think about. We shouldn't take things for granted. That's why I think for example, things that people do in companies or in organizations where they get together and they all talk about and they strategize or they review or they workshop or they. They set goals or short-term goals, long-term goals, and they sort of reassess where the organization is going. That's a really good thing to do, and it's a really good thing to involve as many people as you can to get input and to...
Yeah. Very good.
Okay.
Shkoyach. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
And hopefully...
If you think about it, everyone doesn't have a real contract when they try somebody out for a job. Because you only write the contract once the person's being tried.
Yes, you could do that. I'm not sure legally how binding it is or how not binding it is. That's so simple, I think. But yeah, there is a period where you can...
Yeah,
3 months trial or something like